We're learning that there's been an explosion at the airport in Kabul. The Pentagon confirmed the explosion, and so far there have been multiple casualties among Afghans, but no information yet on any U.S. casualties. The explosion happened at Abbey Gate at the airport. This photo is circulating on Twitter that shows some of the aftermath. Wall Street Journal reporter Dion Nissenbaum tweeted, "The explosion appears to have happened near Baron Hotel across from Kabul airport. Baron was used largely by Brits. Many injured." Richard Hanania, president and founder of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology, is also here to discuss it. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
And Alyssa, I wanted to start with you, though. Can you tell us a little? We don't have any confirmation yet that this attack was carried out by the ISIS affiliate in Afghanistan, but that they are the most likely suspect. That is who the U.S. intelligence community had been suggesting was plotting something exactly like this. So can you tell us a little bit about who is ISIS-K and why would they be motivated to do something like this as we're within 24 to 36 hours of leaving?
Yeah, absolutely. As I've stated on this program before, the threat environment and the terrorist environment within Afghanistan is diverse. You've got the Haqqani network, al-Qaeda remnants, Iranian militias. You've got the Taliban, obviously, and then you've got ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan, who are basically a subset of the broader ISIS that we know globally. They're small in numbers in Afghanistan. They don't have a strong or sophisticated posture and presence within the country, but they're known to do one-off suicide attacks as well as IED kind of explosions. And I would note, important for this moment in time, in November of 2020, ISIS-K took responsibility for an attack on a soccer stadium right as the U.S. was reaching peace talks with the Taliban, seeking to derail those efforts. And at the time, there was a big disinformation campaign online to say that the Taliban was in fact responsible for the attack, again, trying to undermine the peace efforts. So, Richard, I would turn to you. What do you make with your expertise of ISIS's decision to engage at this time? Do they want to derail U.S. departure? Do they want the U.S. to stay? Is it merely sowing chaos? What do you make of this?
So we don't know who did it, but like you said, the ISIS-K is the most likely suspect. Nothing about the Taliban or how it's behaved suggests it would be them at this point. They seem pretty committed to getting the U.S. out and making it as easy as possible for the U.S. to get out. So undertaking a suicide attack at this time, would not make a lot of sense. So this organization, you look at it and there's it's hard to know because there's an internal rivalry within Afghanistan. And the U.S. in recent years has actually been helping the Taliban fight ISIS-K. They've not directly, but they've been listening in. Basically, there was a story in the Washington Post that they would listen into their fights and then they would come in and just bomb ISIS-K when they could. So this is an organization that's some say it's a radical splinter of the Taliban, but it's more extreme. It's more internationally focused. So a movement like that wouldn't care necessarily if the U.S. got out of Afghanistan or it didn't, while the Taliban just wants to rule Afghanistan. So their interest is to let the U.S. out as quickly as possible. I think ISIS-K is, they're in a weak position because the Taliban is going to have the prestige of having expelled the foreign invader, and I think that their best hope of actually staying relevant is if the U.S. stays. So that's the real potential terror threat from Afghanistan. I think they're trying to throw a wrench in the withdrawal plans, and that's probably what's happening. I mean, we don't know much, but everything about that makes sense.
Yeah, we're monitoring it in real time. This morning on the show, we had said that there was a credible threat. The White House had alluded to the potential of threats emerging to the airport. And of course, President Biden put out that warning to Americans in the region saying you have 36 hours to get to the airport. Then rapidly this morning, they were telling folks don't go to the airport. So it seems the U.S. was pretty aware that there was potential of a threat coming of this nature. We're continuing to get updates from on the ground.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about who this group is and where they're situated on the spectrum in Afghanistan. So what a lot of people in the U.S. might not quite understand, that despite the fact that al-Qaeda was housed in Afghanistan prior to 9/11, the Taliban have always been a domestic movement. Like they do not have designs beyond their own borders. And it's not obvious that the Taliban had any idea that Al Qaeda was planning something as big as 9/11. It's more likely that Saudi Arabia had a lot more insight into what Al Qaeda was planning than the Taliban did, and that's a significant reason why they were willing to kind of turn Osama bin Laden over afterwards. And so, after ISIS becomes so powerful in Syria and Iraq, they started spreading around the world and had this kind of chapter that they started to try to form in Afghanistan. The Taliban very quickly wrote to ISIS and said, no, thank you. Get your people out of here. We've got this covered. They didn't listen, and a hot war broke out between ISIS-K and the Taliban, which the Taliban won. I mean, they didn't entirely, obviously, eliminate them, but they have whittled them down to such a small number that what they're capable of pulling off are these large-scale attacks on very soft targets. So, Alyssa, I think it is important to kind of pull on the string that you talked about, which is that their motivation, in some ways, is the same as some U.S. hawks for the U.S. to stay in Afghanistan. So do you expect to see people exploiting this attack to say, look, see, we do need to continue this endless war?
Well, the thing that's very unique about ISIS is they're virtually an enemy of everyone in the region. The Iranians hate them, the Haqqanis hate them, Al-Qaeda does, the Taliban does, the Americans do. So they don't have allies beyond their own ideology, and they certainly, within Afghanistan, don't have alliances outside of their organization. So this, to me, I would say is somewhere between just purely exploiting chaos and trying to take advantage of the situation, or to derail what might be probably the best collaboration you've seen between the U.S. and the Taliban in recent years, how they have generally, I don't give them too much credit, but generally helped give safe passage to Americans to the airport. And I just want to note, we're now hearing reports from the French ambassador that there may have been a second explosion outside of Hamid Karzai Airport. So this is very much a developing situation. What's going to be interesting to watch coming out of this, though, is how does the Taliban respond to this? And again, we can't assign blame yet. We don't know that it's ISIS-K. That's just what the common wisdom would lead us to believe. But this inevitably will have hurt Taliban forces, potentially Americans, potentially innocent Afghans as well as Europeans trying to escape the region. So what does retaliation look like from the Taliban would be one of the questions I'd have.
Yeah, occupation, I mean, what we've learned, I think, in the greater Middle East in the last 20 years is occupation is really fuel for more and more extremism. I mean, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before we went in there. Then there was an Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And then there was an ISIS, a more extreme organization. If you look at Afghanistan, the reason the internationalist Islamists, the people from Saudi Arabia like bin Laden, came into the country in the first place was to fight the jihad against the Soviets. They weren't, the international jihad was not something that the Afghans were necessarily interested in before. And so I think that the terrorists, in the sense that the ISIS, the farthest along the spectrum that want a total war with the West, I think they realize this. And I think that if you're a moderate Islamist and you only care about Afghanistan, you might be happy with the Taliban victory. I think if you're ISIS-K, I don't think that's that's necessarily the best outcome. So it makes sense that they'd want to keep the U.S. as long as possible. And as Ryan said, there is common cause, obviously, with the hawks in the United States, who basically will use any terrorist threat. It doesn't matter, if the terrorists are on our side or on the other side. In Syria, there's Al-Qaeda, there's extremists. It's the government that's fighting them. They'll use it as an excuse to want to fight the government. So it really doesn't matter. They just want to they want to scare people. They want to throw out the word terrorism. And then when people hear terrorism, they say, oh, well, we must be there, when it's actually our presence that's making it more dangerous.
Well, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, and I've harped on this a bunch, but letting the airport at Bagram fall was such a strategic disaster to basically signal there is one point of entrance and exit from the country at Hamid Karzai. It was ripe for a moment like this, that it would be targeted by extremist elements within the country, whereas had we had multiple points of entry and exit, not to mention before Bagram fell, had we kept a small troop presence there, we would have been able to secure airspace around around it. There were multiple evacuation points. We had sophisticated weaponry on site as opposed to Hamid Karzai, which is a commercial airport for all intents and purposes, and we had to just bring all of that in with us. It's remarkable to me how poorly planned this was and how so much of this kind of seems predictable. I'm thinking of things we were saying on this set days ago that are now coming to fruition, unfortunately. But Kim, your thoughts?
Well, I'm wondering if this is going to speed up that 36 hours that they'd already put. We were supposed to be out August 31st. They said, okay, we're not going to extend that deadline. Now, then earlier this morning, it was 36 hours. And now with these additional bombings, I'm curious if they're going to even bump that up even further. So that is definitely a concern for everybody, of course. But yeah, when it comes to, I think it is really important for people to understand the motivations of ISIS, right? And if the West and these, infidel invaders are gone, then they've got a challenge, a narrative problem on their hands when they then try to take on the Taliban, right? Because then it's like, well, why are you fighting the Taliban when you wanted to be run under this Islamic law and you're getting it now? And so, what's the problem?
The resistance Democrats, they need Trump.
Right,
it's like,
right.
they feed off of that energy. But there are now reports coming in that ISIS was involved with this assault. That's what we're getting from Ben Parker here at Politico and others, which is, as we said, not surprising because nobody else really has the motivation to do something like this inside Taliban. The Taliban wants all of this to go smoothly. They want to govern the country, and for ISIS-K, there isn't much worse for them than having the Taliban take over the country and govern it. That squeezes them out. It is preferable, to them to have the United States have some sort of presence so that they can have something to feed off.
At this.
Right.
Yeah. I think, it's easy to say, they could have done the evacuation differently. Anything else you wanted to do could have had a lot of problems. So Bagram Air Base is the reasoning for not using that for evacuations is it's something like 40 miles north of Kabul. Where are the people who want to be evacuated? They're in Kabul, right? So the U.S. has had trouble securing just the perimeter of the airport. You're going to have to secure a 40-mile road from the people who are in Kabul to want to get out to Bagram. A lot of people say that the U.S. was telegraphing the moment that they were leaving. That's a problem. In Bagram, they did the opposite. They left in sort of the middle of the night, and the Afghan partners on the ground were upset and said, "Why'd you leave so quickly?" And if you do that, you can't get people out. If you do telegraph it, you could have people stampeding to the airport. So the point is, this is a mess. We're incompetent. We can't do anything in Afghanistan. If you told us to secure, a few blocks, it would be very, very tough. And so it's right now you're doing this evacuation of U.S. Of American citizens and of people that we want to take with us.
Yeah.
It's just very, very hard. Actually the U.S. told people to leave. There was a State Department warnings for people to leave before this. Everyone knew the day we were getting out, and the U.S. government was basically telling people we can't protect you. Now people made their own estimation of how long the Afghan forces would last, and that was wrong. But it's really there's no flawless way to do it, and I don't know. I don't know even what's a good way to do this. This is going to look ugly because we've totally failed in this country. The government was completely fake, and there's just not many good ways to get out of a situation like that.
No, I think that's a fair point. The one thing I would note, though, on Bagram is so you have Americans all over and Afghans we were planning to evacuate under Civ all over the country. So it's important to remind viewers who aren't that familiar with Afghanistan, it's a massive country about the size of Texas. To get from one side to the other, the west to the east, that could be as long as a 15 to 16-hour drive. We had plenty of people we were trying to evacuate who were not just in Kabul. I was working with a family that was based in Herat, which is about a 13-hour drive from the Kabul airport. So we were trying to make the point to the State Department of having one point of exit and entry is extremely dangerous for moments like what we're tragically seeing unfold right now, but also just a logistical nightmare. You're telling people to travel through rogue Taliban territory to hopefully get to the one location, as opposed to at least you have the benefit of a massive, 20,000-foot airfield at Bagram had it been secured. But again, to your point, Richard, we could debate what we could have done differently endlessly, and I think think what we have to recognize is we're in this moment. It seems to be a disaster. It's unfolding in real time, and nobody seems to have a good solution on how we deal with the next 36 hours.
Yeah, and Richard, I want to linger on one point that you made there. What does this attack, say about this idea that we've been hearing from so many in the mainstream media that they didn't like the way that the withdrawal was carried out. They wish that it had been carried out in a more effective and efficient and orderly fashion. I mean, they want to will a world into existence that just doesn't exist. Like they want all of these different elements in Afghanistan, to cooperate with their need, to have a perfectly orderly exit from this 20-year catastrophe that they created. And as it has been unfolding over the last 2 weeks, it has been quite orderly, and there's been negotiations back and forth between the Taliban and the U.S. as orderly as you could imagine something like this going for the last 10 days, 80,000+ people airlifted. But you still have a dangerous country, and you have elements that are outside of U.S. control. And I think it's that part that bothers people so much. They cannot countenance the idea that there is anything outside of U.S. control. Richard, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a disaster. The fact that the Afghan government fell so quickly actually makes it a little bit easier, because you just have one group you have to deal with, the Taliban, and you have ISIS-K. But imagine if the government was still there, and the Taliban and ISIS and the government were all fighting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a mess. I mean, the U.S. there's a 2-mile road between Hamid Karzai International Airport and the U.S. Embassy. And the U.S. would not drive it. The U.S. just took helicopters there. So you have a 2-mile road, the most important road in the country. You haven't even secured that. So you said you could set up other locations, Bagram. Kabul has the best infrastructure in the country. Anywhere else is going to be more difficult to get to. Maybe it's closer to people, but the roads are contested. They're under Taliban rule. The government roads tend to be worse because you have to pay more in tolls, because the Taliban just takes one toll road, while the place is controlled by quote unquote the government. Tended to just shake you down at every chance that they got. And so this was a mess no matter what. And instead of seeing this as just a refutation of everything that the war hawks have been telling us for 20 years, you can go back to get the quotes from 2005, 2010, 2015. They're saying we're turning the corner. They're fighting for us. They're almost ready. They can go on their own. We're building a new civil society. All of that was just completely fake. I mean, it did not. It's worse than Vietnam. It's worse than the Soviet pullout. It just collapsed. The moment we were sure that the U.S. was going to get out. And this should be a moment where we should be looking at this class of people who fought this war and pushed this war for 20 years and say, what were you doing? And, we could say Biden wasn't perfect. But now, the political incentives are such that it's not Joe Biden. It's 20 years. It's because there won't be any more U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, hopefully. All the 20 years of failure, lands just on his head. And it's really unfair, and it's really, sad. And I think it makes it more difficult for any other president who wants to defy the generals, the national security bureaucracy, and the media. They know even if they've lost Afghanistan, they think that they're going to exert a long-term political damage on this presidency. And maybe they're right, and maybe they're wrong. But I think that's what they're doing at this point.
Right.
The local reports, local media in Afghanistan are saying that 11 have been killed. And some potentially British military, some U.S. military have been injured that we know of. And there was apparently gunfire as well as the bombing.
And I just have to note, part of the discussion coming out of our departure from Afghanistan is going to be how vulnerable we made our allies. This has been a NATO-led coalition for the last 10 years. And the rapid departure of the U.S. left many Germans, French, and others vulnerable British officials in the region when we just so quickly left. And if we're now seeing potential casualties there, I think that's going to raise further questions about the U.S.'s commitment to its allies in those relationships.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Stay tuned. We'll have more for you up next.